Hi, it's Dwyer. It is November 29th, 2025. Dwyercrime.blog. Also, keeping it free.blogspot.com. Let's talk about the Boston Strangler. In fact, let's talk about this show on Oxygen Crime Channel, the Boston Strangler, Unheard Confession. But first, remember, the opinion you should follow should be your own. Just consider this video to be a second opinion from a complete stranger online. Now, folks, let me make a few points. First, let me just say I'm not a criminal profiler. I'm simply a neighbor, right? This is just one layman talking to whoever is here online about hunches, about evidence, about what we think happened, right? Let me also point out that the show on the Boston Strangler is excellent, right? But please don't leave the show until you've watched the second hour. That's the eye-opening part of the show, right? Just understand, they raise questions in that second hour that run against current consensus views. You need to be alert. Now, I study true crime, and there are some crimes where I believe I have an idea on who did what, but I simply don't have the evidence to create a video, right? One of them are these Boston Strangler cases, right? Let me just point out that I believe the early stranglings involving women who are older, right? Let's go through the ages here of the first few victims: 55, 68, 65, 67, 77, right? I believe those murders were done by a guy named Charles Terry, right? Terry was from Maine, where he assaulted an older woman. He then is shuttling between Boston and New York. In New York, we know he killed an older woman, right? Understand, a lot of these murders are believed to have taken place on weekends, when Terry would travel to Boston and, by his own admission, would stay in boarding rooms that were relatively close to where bodies were found. But understand, the Terry theory has problems. For one, Terry was 6'5", right? It would be hard to miss him. There just aren't witnesses around these murders who saw a guy 6'5" in the building, talking to people. Also, Terry, diagnosed as an intelligent psychopath with a sexual sadism disorder, doesn't seem to me to have the social skills to talk his way into women's apartments, right? He's not socially adept. He's a psychopath. I believe people talking to psychos would start to realize that they don't have normal voice inflection. Look at these psycho shows on ID Network, for example, right? Where they, Discovery Network, where they're talking about, psychos doing crimes. And you'll notice the psycho doesn't know how to reflect the mood in the room, The other problem I have with Terry, why I haven't made a video about him, is that, the ages of the women are 55 and up. I'm talking about just the early victims. I'm not sure how a visitor to a bustling city like Boston would be able to figure out where older victims lived. Right? I'm in town for a weekend. I'm staying at some boarding house. Um, what time do I have to case nearby locations so that I could target women 55 and older? Right? So, you know, while Terry, no doubt, is a murderer, there just isn't enough evidence here to say he definitively did these first 5 murders. Now, let me say something about Sam Shepard, and it needs to be mentioned. I did a series of videos here online about not Sam Shepard, but F. Lee Bailey, Sam Shepard's attorney, who happens to be Albert DeSalvo's attorney. Right? He's the one who reaches the agreement with the powers that be that his client will confess to the Boston Strangler crimes, but the confessions couldn't be used against him. Now let's pause for a moment here and just think about it. So Bailey and DeSalvo then had to be pretty much certain that there was no forensic evidence at these murder scenes that would tie DeSalvo to the murder scene. In other words, DeSalvo's saying, you can't use my confession. But it seems to me that he would have been up the creek without a paddle if his DNA was at different murder scenes and law enforcement was able to develop witnesses who saw him at these murder scenes. To me, the deal struck between DeSalvo, F. Lee Bailey, and law enforcement in Boston reeks of a guy who knew there wasn't corroborating evidence. Now let me say this about F. Lee Bailey. When I first started researching the Sam Shepard case, I thought, Bailey is one of these guys who wants his client to win at all costs. Right? But that's not what I found. Believe it or not, in researching the Sam Shepard case, Bailey is the credible person. He had a theory on the case that's actually supported by evidence. I actually believe that Bailey isn't some hotshot lawyer who wants to get his client off. No, I believe Bailey himself is convinced of either his client's guilt or innocence. Right? I believe he's highly credible. Now here, he firmly believes that DeSalvo did these murders. I don't. Right? And let me tell you why I don't. And again, I'm not an expert. You need to read the personalities and the evidence yourself. On the Oxygen Crime Channel show, they actually have a woman who I did not know existed. Right now, she is the woman who rented the apartment that a later victim was found in. Right? She rented the apartment. She had an encounter with the measuring man, Albert DeSalvo. She actually ran into him more than once, right? He actually started measuring her, and she saw his hands shake a little bit. She felt uneasy. So she said to him, they're in her apartment, she said, why don't we continue measuring me outside? And DeSalvo agreed, right? DeSalvo shows back up at her apartment another time, right? She had dark hair, just like the woman who rented the apartment after her, right? DeSalvo may have had a type. Understand, the victimology here is inconsistent. The early stranglings are all older people, 55 or older, right? DeSalvo, if you believe he's involved in the later stranglings, right, is dealing with younger women. Well, just understand, this woman claims that one day she gets a knock on the door. She goes over to the door. It's DeSalvo. She has the chain on the door. As she opens the door suddenly, right, she hears him on the other side. As she opens the door suddenly after a delay, DeSalvo is masturbating in front of her door. Right? She then closes the door, talks to him through the door. He, hurt, starts whimpering on the other side of the door. Folks, I believe that's who Albert DeSalvo is. I don't believe he is an intelligent psychopath with a sexual sadism disorder like Charles Terry. Right? I believe DeSalvo is a rapist. I believe he's using this, let me measure you for dresses. Right? We're looking for models. Let me measure you. I believe that's his gimmick to get into women's apartments, right? Many of these apartments don't have forced entry. And then once he's in the apartment, he's doing things like raping women and stuff like that. But understand, you have measuring man victims who are still alive, who can actually tell us about the interaction, who could actually tell us how violent he was, how threatening he was. Right, folks? DeSalvo is not Ted Bundy. He's not Charles Terry. Right, this is a guy doing horrible crimes, but he's almost apologetic to his victims. In other words, this is the guy who's smooth with women in the first inning. Right? He gains their trust. He's measuring their bodies. They're allowing him, even though he's a stranger. He's polite. A woman feels that she could say to him, let's do this outside, and that he'll agree. And then they leave. Right? Folks, that's not the person, in my opinion, who did any of these crimes. Any of them. Let me also say, too, that the woman they have on the Oxygen Crime channel who's talking about her interaction with Albert DeSalvo, right, when she lived in an apartment in which a woman later gets killed, supposedly by the Boston Strangler. Hints that DeSalvo might be involved in that murder, if you believe he's a murderer. right? Because he may have returned to that apartment looking for the woman who moved out of town after encountering the measuring man and after having him the second time, at least the second time, that he sees her masturbating right outside her door. Right? So just understand, I don't believe, some of these crimes are so brutal that I just don't believe DeSalvo, who, is supposed to have strangled victims. I don't believe DeSalvo would suddenly change his MO. And for the Beverly Sammons murder, and Sammons is 23, right, would suddenly feel a need to stab her, right, go from committing multiple murders where knives are not involved to suddenly feeling a need to take out a knife and to stab her several times, including about 17 times in the heart area. Right? I don't believe the person who did the Sammons murder did the other murders. Let me also say, too, there's a black woman who's a victim here, Sophie Clark. Right, folks? I'm sure someone can find serial killers who killed victims of different races. But I can't emphasize enough to you how rare that is. Right? I'm supposed to believe that someone who's killing white women in their 50s and up suddenly decides to kill an African American woman. I'm not buying it. Right? I believe, a serial killer with a predilection to kill white females is, to paraphrase the great Nat King Cole, afraid of the dark. Right? We all have our sexual preferences, our fetishes. I just don't think someone killing older white women is suddenly going to drop down to kill an African American woman in her 20s. Right? I just don't buy it. In other words, the victimology here is too, how do you put it? It's too disparate. So, Ida Erga, whose body is found August 23rd, 1962. She's 77 years old. By the way, I privately believe that's the last killing that Charles Terry did. She's 77 years old. I'm supposed to believe that the criminal who was killing in bunches, let's go through the dates. First victim, June 14th, 1962. Second victim, June 30th, 1962. Third victim, September 8th, 1963. Right? These aren't in the proper order here. Another victim, August 20th, 1962. Right? Ida, August 23rd, 1962. I'm supposed to believe that the killer then takes off, waits until December 5th, 1962, before he kills his first African American victim, 20-year-old Sophie Clark. Folks, I'm not buying it. Right? Well, let me just say a few more things here. I'm going to discuss, because I believe since the methodology is so different, I believe it needs to be discussed. I believe someone here needs to be considered. I'm going to discuss the murder involving the stabbing. right? The murder of Beverly Sammons. Now, she's 23 years old, right? Some sources place her as old as 26, but she's younger. She's a graduate student at Boston University. She was pursuing an MED in music education. Now, this murder's a little controversial. It's been covered up. She worked as a music therapist and a counselor at a school that was for people who were developmentally challenged. Right? She would have people with intellectual disabilities over at her apartment for what was called informal sessions. Right? Now, just understand, on May 8th, 1963, she misses choir practice at her church. Right? She had a fiance. The fiance goes over to her apartment and finds her body. Her apartment's on the first floor. Right? It's at 4 University Road in Cambridge near Harvard Square. She had been dead for at least 2 days. Right? Now she's nude. Not in her bed, but on a couch. In other words, the MO here is very different. Her hands are bound behind her back with a silk scarf. Right? She's been strangled with nylon stockings and handkerchiefs around her neck. But the ligature is decorative, not fatal. Now, believe it or not, the Boston Strangler, if we believe this is the same person who had done the prior crimes, decided to stab her 4 times in the throat and 18 times in a bullseye pattern on her left breast. Right, folks? This is a person who's involved in music education. The throat wound, to me, and again, I'm a layperson, would seem to be to prevent her from singing. The left breast lines up with the heart, doesn't it? Seems like this is an effort here by someone who knew her to riddle her heart. You know, it's as if the person resents her because of the subject matter in which she is passionate, takes away her voice, and takes away her heart. Right? Now, interestingly enough, it looks like the attack, and she's totally nude. It looks like the attack took place as she was typing out a term paper. So this person had to come over. She has a typewriter with paper in it, right? Middle of a type job. She also has notes on her desk. So here you have the Boston Strangler showing up, not to measure her or anything like that. You get the feeling the Boston Strangler shows up. This is a grad student doing work. He gets her to strip, then starts stabbing her on her sofa. Now here's where the case takes a twist. Right? You're thinking to yourself, gee, would Albert DeSalvo, a guy who would apologize to some of his victims, right? This guy's a rapist. He has some measuring man persona. He's going around attacking women in a way where he's not stabbing them. Right? In a way where some of the victims talk about how, as he's violating them, he's being polite somehow. Now here, you have a woman who's stabbed 22 times. So you have a informal student of hers, someone who has been to her apartment socially. Daniel Pinocchio, 28, right, who has some developmental challenges. And he actually gets arrested for what's classified as lewd and lascivious behavior, right? Indecent public exposure. Days after Salmon's body is found. So while he's talking to the cops, he then confesses to killing Salmons. Now, at this stage of the investigation, not everything has hit the press. Right? Just understand that this individual who had been to her apartment socially, who was an informal student of hers, right? This individual claims he visited her apartment. They argued, right? And that he stabbed her in a rage. In other words, prior victims of the Boston Strangler had not been stabbed. This couldn't have been a copycat. Right here, he's telling the police that he stabs her in a rage after she rejected him sexually. The kicker is he talked about how he interrupted her typing. Right? He knew that she was typing a term paper. This guy had inside information. This guy knew that she had been stabbed. Let me say this. DeSalvo, in the tapes that they air on Oxygen Crime Network, talks about how he stabbed her with a switchblade. That's incorrect. Right? He talks about how he took the switchblade with him. Folks, she's stabbed with a paring knife. The assailant leaves the bloody knife in the sink in the kitchen. Right? So DeSalvo's getting key stats wrong. This guy, I'll say his name again, Daniel Pinocchio, isn't. Believe it or not, the police are skeptical. Now, I can only guess, and this is just a guess, that the fact that the guy is developmentally challenged, the fact that the guy was arrested for public exposure, right? The fact that by this point you're deep into the murder spree of the Boston Strangler, who no doubt, the police were viewing as some sophisticated criminal, and this guy didn't fit that profile, may have taken the cops off his trail. Folks, this guy, and this is a murder scene where no semen is left, right? Just understand, this guy is a much more credible suspect for the Salmon murder than Albert DeSalvo. The fact that DeSalvo, is making up the type of knife that was used in the stabbing. And DeSalvo, because he seems to have studied these cases or received information about the cases, knew a lot about them and would know that this case stands out as the one case involving a stabbing. He would realize how important the stabbing issue is. Right? The fact that DeSalvo didn't know that the murder weapon was a knife that was found in the sink of the kitchen should draw red flags. Well, just understand, the police don't charge Daniel Pinocchio. They let him go. Today it's unclear why. Right? The guy even knew that she was typing a term paper. He knew that. Right? The guy knew this victim had been stabbed. He knew private information. Why is that germane when we talk about Albert DeSalvo, but it's not germane when we talk about other killings like this killing? Well, let's talk about the big reveal, right? Let's talk about the Mary Sullivan murder. And it's very important here. Just understand that they exhumed her body. They found semen samples around her private parts, we'll call it. Right? Just understand that an academic group then looked at the semen samples to see if they matched Albert DeSalvo, who on the tapes said that he had, let me use diplomatic language, that he had consummated his encounter with her, and he believed that, he had left bodily fluids inside of her. Okay, so understand, they exhumed the body. They had a DNA sample from a DeSalvo relative. They compared the sample to the DNA found in Mary Sullivan. This is the 2001 press conference, and they concluded that it was not a match. They have that press conference on the Oxygen Crime Channel. Right now, that's important because DeSalvo on tape is talking about how he consummated their relations. Right now, Mary Sullivan is 19 years old. She hasn't been in Boston that long. She has 2 roommates. Right, folks? This crime doesn't fit the MO of many of the other murders where the person lived alone. Right? Mary Sullivan has 2 roommates. And we're to believe that some guy lets himself in, right? Isn't DeSalvo's pitch needing measurements to, size a dress up for the woman he is, scheming on? Isn't that premised on the woman living alone? Right? We're to believe that he kills this woman. A broom is involved. Right? It's violent. There are cases, the salmon case, where no semen is left. We're to believe that DeSalvo leaves semen at this scene in this victim. Right? So understand what happens next. And it's very important. I believe he's the nephew of Mary Sullivan, right, who's trying to solve the crime, talks to people, and hears that a red-haired boyfriend of someone in the building was seen around the crime scene. Right? He also finds out that this person contacted police to get an update on the status of their investigation. So he does some digging, right? He's able to do some digging because this person has red hair, so they stand out. And he finds out who that boyfriend was. And that boyfriend is now living in New Hampshire someplace, right? And that boyfriend, has moved on with his life. And he's able to contact someone who lives in the town where the boyfriend, the ex-boyfriend now, right, lives. And he asks the person who he knows well, right, who, believe it or not, is doing a TV series, a video series with this boyfriend of a friend who he suspects was involved in his aunt's crime. And he asks his friend to get a DNA sample. The friend does so surreptitiously, right? The guy wears a hat, he puts down the hat, the friend's able to grab hairs from the hat. He sends it to Kerry Sherman, I believe, is the nephew's name. They, of course, send it to the lab to compare with the DNA swab taken from his aunt's exhumed body. And, folks, it comes back a match. Right, so here's where it gets interesting. He then gives an interview where he says, look, we are narrowing down the scope of suspects. And the guy in New Hampshire panics and tells their mutual friend he has to get a lawyer. He goes further and says, I was young at the time. Right? Now, folks, you later have the Boston PD and law enforcement give an interview years later where they dramatically conclude, after years of saying there's no evidence, right? There's, after years of, in essence, saying nothing ties Albert DeSalvo to the Mary Sullivan murder, suddenly we are to believe that the Boston PD, a very advanced police department in a city known for its intellectualism, right? Boston's the town of Harvard, right? Boston's the town of Fidelity Investments, right? Boston is, the town of Fraser these days, right? The fictional character. Well, let's just say we're to believe that Albert DeSalvo left visible semen stains on the sheet that the Boston police did not test until 2012, 2013. Right after the city's most notorious, one of America's most notorious serial killers, had killed 13 women. Right after Albert DeSalvo confessed to being the serial killer under some deal where his confessions couldn't be used against him. You mean to tell me under those circumstances I'm to believe that semen stains that look like stains on regular pictures were never tested? Folks, let's just say I'm not sure I believe that. Let me say this too. Personality-wise, and this is the only murder with any DNA linking Albert DeSalvo to it. The only one. Right, folks? I'm not sure I buy it. Nor does this Oxygen Crime Channel show. Right? Just understand. Mary Sullivan has semen in her. We know that that semen's not Albert DeSalvo's. Now we're to believe that Albert left semen on the sheets? That contradicts his testimony on the tapes, which they play for you on the show. Right? In other words, Mary Sullivan had sex with someone. Right? The DNA comes back a match for a guy in New Hampshire who's no longer with us. It seems like the police should be able to have a test of that guy's DNA, a formal test of that guy's DNA, and to compare it with the DNA found in Mary Sullivan. Right? If you believe her nephew, that test has already taken place, but it was done privately. Right? That person would be a more credible murderer/rapist than Albert DeSalvo. Right? I don't mean to excuse DeSalvo's status as a serial rapist. Right? But understand, you have victims who are alive today who were raped by Albert DeSalvo. The Mary Sullivan rape is extremely violent and involves a broom. DeSalvo, in his taped interview, mentions the broom. Right? But you have to ask questions like, gee, how could he have that information? Let me just tell you, too. He's in prison. Right? I'm just telling you that when lawyers are involved and someone is being investigated for a crime, the state has to give you any exculpatory evidence that they have. Right? So just understand, people are asking questions like, how did DeSalvo know these facts? He could have had a backdoor channel with Boston police, right? Understand, the era is different than today. Right? Today, crooks can't profit from their crimes. Back then, they could. Right? DeSalvo could have thought, look, I'm going to have the TV deal. I'm going to be able to write a book on all of this. My family is going to be taken care of. He could have said to some Boston police officer or someone with connections, I'll split book deal money with you. Somebody in prison with him. He could have said, look, if they have investigated you and they're telling your lawyer what evidence they have against you, share that information with me. I'll split whatever book deal that I get out of this. Right? Just understand, someone was to visit him the day after he gets killed in prison. Right? And that person believes, and that person's featured on the show, that person believes that DeSalvo was going to openly admit that he wasn't the Boston Strangler. Now, that would have little downside to DeSalvo, other than losing the book deal and stuff like that. But it could have major downside to others. In other words, if I'm the actual murderer of Sophie Clark, right, if I did some of these Boston Strangler murders, I'm in the clear. As long as somebody else confesses to the murder. Right? Albert DeSalvo had confessed. If he retracted that confession, there'd be consequences and repercussions. Right? Suddenly, the police would then say, wow, now he's saying he didn't do it. We don't have any physical evidence. Let's look at these three other suspects. Let's look at Charles Terry. Let's look at some of these other guys. Right? So it's interesting that DeSalvo had an appointment to meet with someone who he was going to tell big things to. And he gets killed that day. Right? It's interesting. Let me close with this. You know, here in the Bay Area, we had a killer, the Zodiac Killer, who now, I believe, astute people understand there is no one Zodiac Killer. Right, folks? Just realize there are police sketches, and they don't match. Right? You know, I want people to go back and look at the Son of Sam killings. Maury Terry, investigative journalist, right? He believes that the Son of Sam was actually a group of people, group of Satanists, right? Go back and look at those drawings from witness sightings. Right, folks? I believe the public isn't fully aware that when you have, you know, a defined killer who has grabbed the public imagination, right? Boston Strangler. I believe the same person did the first 5 killings, right? I just believe that's 6'5" Charles Terry. You're going to have copycats. You're going to have people hiring others who have read the paper, have read the news reports, and know how to tie the bow, know how to mimic the Boston Strangler. Right? So, one of these women, after she got killed, her boss came forward, her married boss, and admitted that he was having an affair with her. Right? That married boss also admitted that she just happened to be pregnant. Right, folks? You're going to have strategic behavior by people. Right? Someone is going to have an incentive to kill someone else. They're going to conveniently be someplace else at the time of the victim's death, but they will have arranged to have someone meet with that person and do a crime that's a copycat crime. Right? You have copycats in the criminal world, right? There was a Zodiac in New York who no doubt thought he was copying one killer in Northern California, when I believe if you look closely at the Zodiac killings, it's different people who did those killings. The Boston Strangler, folks, there is no way Albert DeSalvo, who, as the measuring man, is not targeting women 55 and over. Right? That's not his fetish. There's no way he killed the first 5 victims here. Right? I would argue it's questionable whether he killed the woman who was having the affair with her boss, her married boss, who was pregnant. Right? Boston PD, I don't know what they're doing. They didn't even arrest the boss. Right? I don't believe DeSalvo kills the music grad student here, who gets stabbed 22 times. Right? If he's not stabbing the others, why would he stab this woman? Right? Am I supposed to believe that DeSalvo shows up and is talking about measuring her at a time when she has a term paper to write, you think that conversation got off first base? When they have a woman on the show who talks about how DeSalvo's actually measuring her. He's using a fake name, by the way. DeSalvo's measuring her, and she didn't like the shake in his hands. She thought something's not right here. She says, let's take that outside, and DeSalvo takes it outside. Now, I'm to believe that DeSalvo shows up. This woman's doing a term paper. The living place is near a campus. In other words, a lot of people are around. This woman is, friendly, has other students over at her place. I'm to believe DeSalvo did that killing? Or that DeSalvo shows up, he's casing a woman, goes to her place, finds out that she has 2 roommates. This is Mary Sullivan. And he then decides, okay, well, why don't I kill her anyway, even though this is high risk? Even though a roommate could walk in on us. Even though I'm being as freaky as possible. I even have a broom involved in the attack. I'm not buying it. I have my doubts. Finally, Boston PD. Folks, you're kidding me if I'm to believe that you have women getting sexually assaulted and there are semen stains on the blanket that you can see in the photos, and they're not tested for decades. I'm sorry, I give Boston police far more credit than that. Right? The positive the positive DNA match, a decade after, the press conference where they told you that there's no match to the semen in the victim and DeSalvo, that just doesn't make sense to me. Let me hear your thoughts. I hope you leave them in the comment section of this YouTube video. Thanks for stopping by.